just for, again, for proper housekeeping, Dr. Gupta will be back, but we have rejoined with us. We have, I'm sorry, is it Dr. Tiles or Tills?
Steve.
Steve.
Steve Tillis.
And Todd, I know that one. And John Yao, who's a representative from an insurer. So John, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon. I'm John Yao. I'm with, excuse me, I'm internal medicine physician by training. I'm Chief Medical Officer of Anthem Blue Cross of California, and I'm here to represent the payer's perspective today.
All right, thanks. So what just happened? So I just want to draw out a little bit because I apologize that I felt like I needed to keep a tempo going that made it a little bit hard to debrief, especially around the first two votes on the clinical effectiveness. And we know from experience that sometimes those votes can be taken in different ways because the language is tricky. The language is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that such and such is better than the other option? Now, that can mean that there's plenty of evidence and we know for sure that it's not better or is better. Or it can mean that there's not enough evidence for us to be sure enough to say that it's adequate evidence that it is better. And those are two very different, if you will, answers, and to have two very different policy implications. And because of the way that this group is constituted, the timing of these reports, it's almost always the situation that we don't have adequate, if we say that there isn't adequate enough evidence, that it's because we lack sufficient evidence, or the type of evidence we need, or that it's inconsistent in some way. It's not that there is adequate evidence to say that the drug or treatment doesn't work. So what I heard in both Elizabeth's description of her rationale and in Jeff's, and I'd invite others if they feel differently, but I think the sense of the room, as I took it around those votes, was that the evidence, to use, I guess, our word, is promising, but that there is not adequate evidence at the current time to demonstrate that there is a net health benefit. So that means usually that we are hungry for better evidence. We are eager. And we know that it's important that that be part of the context. But I also heard, as part of the feedback from the group, that they sense a responsibility to send a signal, I guess, upstream to manufacturers that this evidence could have been adequate, that there was a way that the evidence could have been generated. We heard from clinical experts, 3 years to know, right, when this is going to happen. In cardiology, it's 5 years to trace out to the clinical effects, and that's the accepted standard to basically get a label to say that it affects kind of patient outcomes in that way. So this is always tricky because when there's significant unmet need, the FDA may often work with the patient community and with manufacturers to create, if you will, a lower hurdle so that we can get treatments out to patients. But that's where there often becomes a real tension with those who are looking at the evidence and trying to make a judgment about whether it's adequate. Maybe that means that the FDA has to put a special little tag on this body of evidence and say, let's see some more over a certain amount of time. We don't even know if the FDA will approve it, obviously. We're here in some sense in a kind of presumption that they will, but we're not 100% sure of that. So I hope that that in some ways helps kind of explain what a vote that just happened could mean. And I'd like to kind of follow through with that to talk more about how this is going to be looked at, this body of evidence, how it's going to be considered by patients, by clinicians, by payers, and manufacturers. You'll certainly get a few curveballs thrown your way, don't worry. We'll do some fun things. So actually, if you don't mind, let me start with the clinical experts first. Because we forget to ask this question sometimes. If cost were not a consideration, if these were 10-cent treatments, how many patients with peanut allergy should try them, take them? Would clinical experts want to treat them with? What's the ideal clinical uptake of these treatments among the relatively large body of patients in the country who have peanut allergy?
So I'm uncomfortable with the word should.
Okay.
It's never should. It's what does your patient want to do?
Right.
I'm there to offer them options. I give them choices. They make decisions. It's not, you should do this, you should do that.
Right.
Here's what you can do. Here's what happens. Here's what's not going to happen, right? Cost may or may not be a consideration to them. I don't know.
So let me rephrase my question.
But at 10 cents, fine. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's something that could potentially help them. It is up for them to decide if A, they want to do this at this juncture, and B, which of these two options would they like to try?
Right.
With the thing saying that if you don't like one, you could probably try another, and maybe there's something else in the pipeline. I don't know. But I mean, again, when you ask a question that says should, it's not that easy, and I think people really don't understand.
Let me help it make it easier.
People don't really understand food allergy, and I think
so
today's been an 8-hour exercise in demonstrating that to some degree. That
Dr. Greenhot, let me just be conscious of the need to talk to everybody on the panel, so I am going to keep your answers. No, just keep your answers as short as possible. So my question should have been rephrased as, what % of patients should be offered in clinical consultation with their clinician the chance to try one of these treatments? We talk about the number of patients with peanut allergy. From a clinical expert perception, should they all be discussed as taking these new treatments if they're both approved? Or is it easy for clinical experts to say, half of them, it would be a mistake from a clinical expert perspective to bring it to the patient for consideration? What is the view from your perspective of the basically the breadth of patients who have peanut allergy who should be offered consideration of one of these treatments? Either one of you.
So if the child qualifies for one of these treatments and they have a true peanut allergy, yes, why not offer it to all patients? Like, there's no reason not to have a discussion with families about these potential treatments. And yeah, I would say every child should be offered the treatment.
And now I'm going to ask you an even less fair question. If you had to guess, what % will take one or the other? Would take one or the other? Just a wild guess. If we had a 10-cent treatment and they were discussed with folks, what do you think?
I mean, like, seriously, I don't. That's a tough question. That's a very individualized question. And there's a lot we don't understand about the patient decision-making process in this. They have lived in an era where we've said therapy is on the horizon, but for now, avoidance. We have to psychologically prime them now for something that could help them if one, two, or hopefully more options are available. So it's an abstract hypothetical question that, as a clinical expert who works at the largest food allergy center in the country, I really can't answer you that. I would agree with her. You can offer it to everybody. You can offer it to nobody. I mean, it's up to them. They come to me.
Right.
I'm not, I'm not paternalistic in telling them you should do this. You should consider this.
You have a better sense of maybe anyone in the room of what the perceived unmet need is among the patients who come to see you. What % of the patients do you think, if this were a cheap treatment, would choose to try one or the other?
I mean, I would say the majority. We published a paper asking parents if they would go into a treatment trial if it was available to them. And I want to say over 80% said yes. So they have an interest in it. So I would say the majority, definitely over 50. I would probably say at least 75%. If it was, a 10-cent treatment and they had an option, and they had an option of the two different types, I would say the majority.
Well, from what you said, it certainly sounds like the patients lining up to pay out of pocket at the OIT clinics are going to be knocking on somebody else's door. Caroline? Yeah, sure. No, I was going to ask you anyway, yes.
Yeah, short 2 cents. As a parent, as a patient, again, talking to lots of different people, when I hear stories of the freedom that these other children, are going through, I'm just piqued. And so I just think you would have a lot of interest, when you're hearing these success stories. So I think quite a few.
Okay. So John, some people assume that payers hear this kind of thing and worry about the potential cost impact on premiums, et cetera. Let's just, again, paint a future in which the FDA has approved one or both of these treatments. Given the vote of this room, I just want to make it really clear, is there any way that a health insurer in the United States would not cover an FDA-approved drug for this condition?
highly unlikely, and there's been precedents, as everyone in this room probably already knew. Exondys 51, right, is a good example of that, eteplirsen. The FDA, in its approval, actually has a specific, explicit indication, label, so to speak, in its prescribing information that explicitly calls out that no benefit has been shown with this treatment, and yet it is still approved. So chances are highly likely both of these treatments will be approved, and we're anticipating January of 2020. We all know that Viaskin is being resubmitted in Q3 of this year, and AR101 is due for approval in January of 2020. So we expect both of them probably in the same time frame.
Okay. Now, one of the things that we like to do in terms of talking about how to translate the evidence through is to talk about what a potential kind of coverage policy might look like at a payer. And they usually have it structured so that there are criteria that the patient needs to meet to be eligible for the treatment. Then they have criteria about what the provider, the doctor, credentials or specialty needs to be. They have rules about how long it can be for, that kind of thing. So I just want to kind of briefly run through some of the options and how the evidence could be translated into coverage policy. And our goal here is not to decide what the correct policies are, but to talk through some of the options that payers will be considering and to make sure that we try to flesh out some of the nuance and the considerations if they're making choices. So let's talk about the patients. I was really struck by the way that we've been talking about peanut allergy like it's one thing. And it's clearly, but we've wrestled with this with the clinical experts. We tried to get them to help us understand, is there a patient with a peanut allergy that's this severe that can be said they're just not that bad with their peanut allergy, but the other kid has a very severe allergy? Because one of the things that payers will frequently do is try to say, again, for whom is this most needed? And are there some people whose form or version of peanut allergy is easily treated with something else or doesn't kind of catch up to a treatment that could be expensive on an ongoing basis? So let's just visit that. Is there any way that payers would want to use either the results of initial allergy testing or some other lab test or some kind of utilization, like has had an emergency room visit for peanut allergy in the last 12 months? Is there any way that you think, from a clinical perspective, that payers or others could think of how to create a gradation of severity among these patients, or not? Talk to you guys first.
Again, this is a very difficult question to answer. I know why you're asking it. I know it makes sense, but we're just not there in the disease state yet to be able to evaluate that. But that doesn't mean that therapies, shouldn't be covered, shouldn't be offered, shouldn't be approved. I mean, in a perfect world, I could look at two kids on paper and I could say, this one is severe. This one's going to have 3.2 episodes of anaphylaxis in the next 5 years. This one's going to have one catastrophic emergency room visit. This one's going to graduate the captain of the soccer team at Harvard and have nothing, right? Again, in a perfect world, I would love for it to be that simple. I wouldn't be losing my hair and be chronically tired and stuff like that. It'd be just a lot easier. But, I'm trying to explain that this disease is a lot more nuanced.
All right, so let me make it harder for you. So a mother and son come into your office, and the mother says, please don't I'm going to be playing devil's advocate to a degree that may seem offensive. And so let me just say now that I really hope not to prove offensive. I want to probe where the thinking of policymakers and others will go with this. And that may mean that I'm going to frame some situations that may seem unfairly stereotypical, et cetera. So I'll try to be sensitive, but bear with me. I'm going to create a scenario that may seem offensive to some. A mother will come in with her child and say that her child felt nauseous after coming home from school and told her that they served peanut butter in the cafeteria that day. The mother comes to see you and wants to know if she should try this new medication she's heard advertised that can prevent or desensitize her child from peanut allergy. She's worried because she knew another mother whose child had very severe peanut allergy and was in the emergency room a lot last year. A payer is going to be asked whether to approve that request for treatment. how does the system manage that? Is it the clinical expert's call? Is there some way that the payer is going to want some kind of documentation of something that means, okay, it's an appropriate case or not?
I want to make sure that you're trying to, so okay, that kid doesn't have peanut allergy? Right, so this is a non-starter. So I wouldn't prescribe a peanut allergy therapy for somebody without a diagnosis.
So let me make it harder back on John. John,
It's
I'm
not
not
that
sure you're
hard.
going to write any kind of criteria at all, other than just say what the doctor says will cover. I have a funny feeling you're not going to do that.
Right.
What would you do?
I don't think anything's that hard. So I'll take a stab at it. From the payer's perspective, right, I don't think they'll ask for titers,
Okay.
IgE or IgG. I don't think that'll happen. I think what's more likely are probably 3 broad coverage criteria that may be worth consideration, so that it's not just taking on all comers, so to speak, right? It's not a free-for-all. So one is that there is a history of peanut allergy, or there's some kind of diagnosis, and preferably that individual has been followed by an allergist.
Right.
Right? Because that's some indication, some validation, right? A second consideration may be, that there's some kind of pharmacy record, prescription refill record, that in the previous year or 2 years, that there's been at least 1 refill for anaphylactic treatment, like an EpiPen or something like that, right? Because that further validates the existence of the condition, but also lends some insight into, that I don't want to say severity, because severity is a very opaque term, but lends some validity to that. And I use that word validity very loosely, obviously. And then, based on the studies, I think there should be an age group, 4 to 17. Right. One is 4 to 11 in one study, for Viaskin, the other one is 4 to 17. So I think payers are likely to take a broader view and be more inclusive and use an age range of 4 to 17. So I think those would be 3 general criteria that may be employed. Now, of course, we don't know for sure, because we don't even know what the FDA approval is going to look like.
I know, we don't know what the label is yet. Which speaks to the eligibility criteria. I can't remember, honestly, and I'm sure the staff behind me do, but was there some measure of the severity or the extent of this peanut allergy history as an eligibility criterion? Did they just have to have a diagnosis by an allergist and nothing else? What was it? How was it done?
I can speak to the Palisade, and I'll let Todd talk about the Pete's, but there had to be, this is a diagnosis by a board-certified allergist involves 2 things. One, the clinical history, which is essential and sort of sets the pretest probability of the disease, and then you do testing on top of that. So we can't just come up with one test result that confirms in all patients, for example. But in the Palisade trial, they had to have a suggestive clinical history, and that was validated by the medical monitor as well. And then they had to have either a positive skin test or a positive blood test. And then, of course, a positive oral challenge.
Right.
And it turns out that those first 2 inclusion criteria that led to oral challenge made it. It was much less likely they'd fail the challenge. It was pretty low screen fail rate during challenges.
So let me just turn it on its head. So the skin patch test and the blood test, if they were both negative, does that have a high sensitivity to rule out that they have peanut allergy?
Absolutely, skin test.
Correct? So there are tests that can be done to rule it out.
One important thing to realize is that even though the Immunocap specific IgE blood test is a really good test for many things, it's not particularly sensitive. And I'm sorry, not specific, sorry. And there were, I think, 11 or so patients in the Palisade trial that qualified, even though they had a negative blood test. So they had a clear-cut oral challenge with the same degree of symptoms as you'd expect with somebody with a very high blood test. So it's not as simple as one test. And as Matt said, you can't just, you can identify whether they have had a history that is compatible with an IgE-mediated clinical reaction, but you can't judge based on that they're not going to have a severe reaction tomorrow or 2 years from now.
Right.
And to assure you,
sure,
we're coming out, I'm the chair of this project for the Allergy Joint Task Force. We're doing a meta-analysis and a systematic review and a cost-effective analysis of peanut allergy testing, specifically to support diagnosis and clinicians who, maybe need a bit of a primer, understanding sort of what's the precision of these tests. Our problem has never been the absence of IgE. That's a real easy thing. You don't need to go to medical school to understand. No IgE, no allergy. The presence of it has baffled us for years, 50 or something years, right?
Yeah, so skin tests, it's rare to have a negative skin test and still have the disease. But
Right.
there's tons of positive skin tests, which is why we preach do not do testing
Right.
if it's not indicated.
You can have a positive test and not have disease. That's the
But
problem.
that's right.
Yeah.
But so back to the payer perspective, then, as you're hearing this, still you think it would be more administratively or clinically reasonable to use a prescription for an EpiPen in the past 2 years instead of requiring some kind of, it's not a confirmatory test, but if it has very high sensitivity, you could ask for a test that if it's negative would then mean that, of course, then the specialist would be highly unlikely to want to prescribe it, obviously. But I'm just probing because, as you said, some payers might want to use a lab test of some kind as part of the criteria. So I just want to try to tease it out again, whether you think there's any reason that they would or wouldn't.
No, it's still my opinion that I don't believe payers are going to ask for titers. I think that's what I said earlier as well.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to be the case. And the difficulty is, even when you have a highly sensitive test that one could say with some confidence could rule out peanut allergy, right? In the environment that we're in, and in the payers environment especially, that is already under scrutiny, not just by the public, but also by regulatory agencies and also attorneys and litigation, that the fact that you don't have a test that can rule it out 100%. And if something should happen, I just don't think payers in general would take a risk, especially a larger payer such as an Anthem, such as, I don't think that's likely. That's just my...
Okay. Carolina, do you want to jump in? Yeah, please.
Yeah, so in addition, to looking at the diagnosis and the clinical history, I also think you also have to look at the quality of life, and is that patient become immobile? Or if they place themselves in a bubble, are there psychological ramifications taking place from like prior allergic reactions, and their history with allergies. And I have to say, when I've met people who've gone through, private practice OIT and so forth, those are their motivations. Because I personally ask is, they're no longer living life. So I do think that has to be part of it too, in terms of the payer, looking at, is this, has the patient, stop living life in a sense, and is this now, inhibiting everything? And then even just looking to the caregivers, again, back to that kind of stress level, is this impacting the health of the caregiver? Are we talking high blood pressure, cholesterol?
Yeah.
It kind of dominoes out. So I think that needs to be a consideration as well.
So yes, sorry, Todd, please.
Just before we leave the point,
Yeah.
I was glad to hear that from John, because I think you started off asking about severity, and it's just, it's really important, I think, to recognize, we do know if you've had a history of severe reactions, you're more likely to have severe reactions in the future, but we can't count on the fact that just because you've only had mild reactions, your reactions will stay mild. We know they're unpredictable. And so this idea of phenotyping patients, we may eventually be there. Right now, we just aren't. And that's the reality. So I'm glad that seems like a reasonable stance to me.
No, I wanted to bring it up, obviously, because it's, there are treatments now for hereditary angioedema, and the same kind of considerations. How severe does it need to be before, and these are very expensive treatments, so there's a lot of thinking around a number of attacks or severity of attacks that would qualify, if you will, for the reasonableness of treatment. Here it sounds like at least one payer is not likely to use IgE or other kinds of lab tests to try to confirm, or see, confirm is the wrong word. It's not confirming the diagnosis. It's making sure that it's possible.
As a criterion.
Right.
Yeah,
It's kind of. Nuri.
I was just going to make the point that that's in terms of the policy for qualifying patients. That seemed that was a helpful discussion, and I'm glad to hear some of the types of ideas that are being thought through. you asked the question earlier around, like, would you have to have a qualification that you had an anaphylactic event in the last year? I mean, some clinical history, I think, is part of the diagnosis workup. Within the last year, I think, is a very over-restrictive type of criteria, because my son didn't have an anaphylactic event. My son has peanut allergy. He didn't have an anaphylaxis in the last year, but he's gone to the ER. He has IG, skin test, EpiPen, sees an allergist. So some of the qualifications that were mentioned are good surrogates for his workup. So that's helpful to hear, and I just encourage that we don't have overly tight restrictions on the clinical history and the timing of.
And even the history, which that's obviously the best, but there are kids where, even though we, all of us preach against testing indiscriminately, but there are kids who get tested because they have egg allergy or a family history or severe eczema, and their test results are highly suggestive that they're allergic. And so even the history, I think we have to be careful with that, because if you come back with a peanut IgE of greater than 100 and a skin test that's 15 millimeters, most people are going to be really nervous about challenging that child unless you're at an academic center that does food challenges all the time. So I think we just have to be careful about being overly restrictive, and requiring the history.
And I would also illustrate, and I'm sure that Matt and Todd have seen this before as well. First ingestion of peanut butter, age 14 months, had a little bit of rash around the mouth. 5 minutes later, said, "Oh my gosh, what's that?" And went in and had a positive skin test. Okay, well, let's avoid peanut. Said, well, let's check the serum IgE next year, and it's 20. Positive is anything greater than 0.35. And then a year or two later, greater than 100. I mean, and then meanwhile, there's this window of immune plasticity that may be closing, or at least becoming tighter and harder to budge. And so there's a lot of dynamics that really don't lend themselves to grand parameters on decision making. What I think we have to do is educate allergists further in what they already know intuitively, but now adapt it to food allergy on a larger scale, so they can make these decisions with the parents.
So Dr. Greenhalgh-Gupta, and maybe actually even more for Dr. Gupta, at the more primary care allergist level, will the existence of FDA-approved treatments change the way that peanut allergy is screened for at all? Or is it still just going to be parents coming in, do a good history, probably doing some of these tests, but I mean, is it going to change in terms of the ways that people think about even screening for peanut allergy now that there's an approved treatment?
So, you go first. I'll take on the screening question.
Okay. I mean, I think even in primary care, how many primary care physicians around this table, we all see kids with food allergy. With 8% of the population having it, it's becoming something we frequently see, and we refer to the allergist. Now, there's two things we're discovering. One is a lot of those kids, especially Medicaid kids, are not often getting to an allergist. So I think there has to be something where the primary care provider learns, just like with asthma, what happened, how to manage some things until we can get them to an allergist. And that's a big part of it. But the treatments are really important too, because if the primary care providers know that treatments exist, then they can initiate that conversation, and that might be another good reason to get to the allergist quickly. They're not going to, but to start that conversation, I think eventually may come into a primary care pediatrician's office.
I'm sorry,
and then
Matt,
screening.
And again, they generally, we're very few people actually come to us primarily. They come from a primary care provider at some level. So, but screening is a very loaded word in the field, again, because we have tests that have exceptionally poor specificity. Really, you wouldn't, if we had anything better, we would use it, but we don't. So, and screening will work if the test specificity raises or the ambient prevalence in the population raises, and there's absolutely a threshold where that becomes cost effective. But no, we shouldn't be fishing for a problem like that. And none of us as an allergist, Steve and Todd are also allergists. They work in industry now, but no allergist is going to start somebody on therapy that they don't need or don't want. That risk just isn't there.
Let me just say, antibiotics for otitis media.
This isn't antibiotics for otitis media. This is not antibiotics for otitis.
Those of us who are primary care docs in different fields.
Give us a little bit more credit for knowing our own tendencies.
No, I'm just saying the scenario in which doctors receive pressure from the outside to use treatments that are on the edge in the gray zone is certainly not unique to allergy, allergy is not immune, I should say, to I wish I'd actually thought of that in advance.
When you're doing immune modulating therapy where there's risk of anaphylaxis, I can assure you nobody is putting people on this therapy just for the heck of it or from pressure. We have a bigger pair than that. We're not going to do that. I mean, honestly.
Well, we can note that as part of the policy recommendation. I think that the breadth of the clinical landscape in the United States and the ways that specialists are remunerated can sometimes mean that they're happy to have a new treatment and to use it in a growing number of patients. And that can be great for patients, but it can be good for doctors' pocketbook as well, and I think we just have to be sensitive to the risks. And let me ask the patients something that, again, might feel unfair. Our parents going to get a sense of guilt pushed on them if they don't have their daughter on treatment. There's going to be a campaign. There's a new treatment available for peanut allergy. Talk to your specialist. And you're a parent who, for whatever reason, doesn't choose to have your child seen by an allergist or to take the prescription. Is there a concern that this could create a bit of a peer pressure problem on parents?
Actually, we've already been there, and it's already part of history. So when private practice, as we call it, private practice OIT came into place, there were several online Facebook groups and social media groups actually exerting pressure on people. And then there was actually pushback from the parent community to those groups and actually shutting down a lot of those group leaders, saying, you know what, you actually don't get to make me feel guilty, because yes, people were actually on there saying, you need to mortgage your home, you need to go move to Utah, why aren't you doing this, you're not a good parent. And so that has actually been there and pushed back, strongly pushed back, from a lot of the advocates and other parents saying, you should never guilt me into anything. So yeah, been there, done that.
So again, it feels like a tremendous responsibility for the clinical community to make sure that these discussions happen in an environment in which parents don't need to feel guilty if they choose not to treat their child. Mary, did I just trigger something?
Well, I was just Caroline said what I was going to say, which is it's already happening.
Yeah.
And just to give another example of that, if a food allergy individual actually does die from their food allergy, you hear comments like, only if they took immunotherapy. And I'm sorry, but obviously from an advocacy perspective, we don't find that acceptable. There's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all treatment. And this treatment is not for everybody, as we discussed in great detail today. So that concern is out there, but that's why we need the community to work with us to make this accessible, to increase the standards, to get this in the hands of trained allergists so it's administered properly and ethically.
Okay. Thank you. If I don't think of others, you can let me know. You can suggest one. I want to circle back to the coverage criteria part now. We've talked a little bit about the patient criteria. We're going to assume that plans are going to require that it be an allergist. Oh, I need to ask though. Plans usually have two boxes they can tick. Must be under the direct care of a specialist or under the care of a physician in consultation with a specialist. John, have you thought at all about that in this context? And
I think either one would be appropriate from my perspective.
And clinical experts sometimes feel differently. Sometimes they feel like this is not one I would want a primary care doc who thinks he has my phone number in his pocket, but I don't really know. What do you think?
I don't want to speak on behalf of the Academy and the college and IACI and the Canadian Society and anybody else who might do this, but I would be shocked if they didn't say under the supervision of an allergist. Now, I don't want to exclude extended care providers and nurse practitioners, PAs working in an allergist office. I think people who are trained and deal with allergy specialty, and there's some sloppy rules about what you can say about an allergy specialist and whatnot. But yes, somebody who is trained and skilled in doing this.
Okay, agreed?
I would agree. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I don't think pediatricians would want to do this in their office either. It's to manage the updosing, et cetera, is not something pediatricians are
slapping
trained
a patch on and saying "see you in a year" could be all right. We'll think about that one.
Yeah.
All right, let me go on.
I know.
Let me go,
I know.
let me go on to the coverage criteria. We've now started the patient on treatment, patient and provider criteria. Something that always comes up is for how long. Now, we've heard that there's no evidence to suggest that you can safely stop and somehow you get benefit. There's just no data there. To be completely honest, and I think the manufacturer would agree, it is not in your organization's financial interest to sponsor studies at discontinuing your drug and seeing what happens. Therefore, it's very unlikely for the clinical community to get robust data on this for quite some time. Payers are going to have to decide, does that mean we literally just keep this going? Or are we going to do some kind of oral food challenge or something else at 6 months or 12 months and either say, that's the sign that it's working and so we're going to keep going with it, or that means it's working well enough that we should try to let them grow out of it? I mean, all these questions of what if they are at that zone where they could grow out of it? How does an allergist know when to stop this active treatment to say if they have grown out of it? How do we translate that both into the clinical practice side, but also into what a payer would do with its kind of ongoing coverage criteria? Can I start with, go ahead.
Me?
Why not?
Okay. So
how quickly should we stop your treatment?
Well, by definition, we don't have enough data to be able to answer that question accurately. We do have data beyond 12 months that suggest the same pattern of the biomarker pattern that we expect with any kind of effective allergen immunotherapy is superimposing exactly the same with AR101 as it has with pollen allergy, bee venom allergy, et cetera. This is a dynamic process, and in fact, I think I want to point out to the committee that the quote maintenance or therapeutic dose, which happens about 6 months, it's not anywhere close to being stable at that point, okay? The only thing that's stable is the dose. The specific IgE, which we measure and is already elevated at the time you start the therapy, is roughly double what you started at 6 months, okay? And that's effective immunotherapy. It takes about 12 months for it to even taper back down to baseline. And then the second year, it goes below that, and then after that. And now I'm extrapolating based on other forms of immunotherapy. But so far, that, and then the IgG, which is sort of a biomarker, it's not relevant for individual patients, but in groups it helps. So the short answer is we can't answer, but the hope is, and I sincerely hope that a remission is possible and that we will have tools to be able to prove that. It's not going to happen in less than 3 years, and it may be 3 to 5 years or more, and it may only be a subset of patients, but that's speculation.
John, any early thoughts on framing the reauthorization criteria?
The truth is, I don't think payers really know for sure, but I'm thinking that certainly at a minimum, the first year, but it's more likely it's going to be a 36-month ramp up with an initial 6-month accelerated uptake. I think that's probably.
But then what would you use at 3 years to decide whether to continue treatment?
Don't have any clue at this point.
So clinical experts, how are you going to provide payers and others with that kind of data? How are we going to learn when it's safe to stop?
So there are a couple of options. So obviously for those who are interested in it and those providers who are willing to do it, I happen to be one who does a lot of these, but there are plenty of others in the country who won't offer a food challenge. Now, there are risks and benefits to that. There are access issues. There's facility issues. I live in the matrix. I work in an academic center. I've got an ICU for food challenges. That's not anybody else's reality, though. Right. So to me, I have the space and the time to do it. But others who are, they're making decisions about access to other diagnoses or whatnot, a food challenge ties up a room for 4 hours. So they're probably not going to do that, and they might be afraid of it. So yeah, a food challenge can certainly help. Other biomarkers, Steve is exactly on par here. Actually, all immunotherapy, EPIT, OIT, even SLIT, all of these have been shown. They elevate your IgE for a period of time, then it falls, then the IgG4 specific to that signal will increase. In venom and in pollen allergy, that seems to be associated with something of tolerance. Now, this will have to be tested out, to see if if this biomarker can work, but that's one way, and maybe there's something else. But there are a number of therapies on the market where we have no known biomarker. I mean, omalizumab is one of them. We don't know why somebody in asthma responds to omalizumab. We don't have a biomarker for it yet. It's approved, it's out there, people use it, people are not unhappy with it, maybe some payers are, but so, and again, in allergen immunotherapy, we don't necessarily have a marker as well. We don't actually know how allergy shots work. That's sort of a big joke. We know it works because it does, but we don't know how it works, and we don't know how long you need it. So, right. We will work these out, but to mandate to a provider that you have to do a challenge, that's not going to meet acceptability by a lot of people. Let us, again, work that out. We're still in the infancy of this, but I think there's hope. Now, if you read our model in GMO Open, one of the things we did uniquely look at was if you could achieve X degree of sustained unresponsiveness, which is this sort of complex word for tolerance, right? Obviously, how do you make an expensive therapy more cost-effective? Well, you stop using it, shorter in its lifespan. So, there are definite levers there for both products that if they can achieve sustained unresponsiveness within 2, 3, 4, 5 years, that will absolutely help. So they have a vested interest in looking at this because it gives more value to their product. I would argue that they want to have them on, indefinitely. I don't think that that's what they want to do. Right? They might want more products on the market, but I don't think they want to tether somebody to 70 years of this therapy per se.
And just to that point, we do have a sustained unresponsiveness part of our phase 3 study, and we had it in phase 2 as well. And most patients in phase 2 who were able to get to the point where they were eligible for that and stopped therapy and came back did maintain their response. So it gets really tough to do like a placebo-controlled study extending out that far.
Right.
And I think this will, if this gets approved, if they both get approved, there will be like investigator-initiated studies. There will be consensus statements. This will be something that the whole community works out. But the manufacturers are not ignoring that, and we are approaching sustained unresponsiveness as something. Right. We're not just saying, be on it forever.
All right.
So.
Well, our general experience looking at many different classes of treatments are that it's extraordinarily rare for industry to sponsor new trials to help understand how to shorten the duration of treatment. I'm not saying that you won't be different, but that the general experience has not been that. So maybe with the general acquiescence, or not acquiescence, approval of the patient community, I think it'd be helpful for us to say as a policy recommendation that patients are going to want to have evidence to help them understand when they can safely consider some trial of going off of these treatments or doing something different, and that the system has to be mobilized to generate that kind of evidence, and that the patient community, I think, will have a strong role in agitating for that, because you want new treatments, but as I understand it, you really would want people to get focused on finding out for how long. Maybe it is for a long, long time, but we need better evidence, because otherwise we're going to be in this soup, I swear, 2 to 3 years from now.
100% agree. We need better tests in food allergy, full stop. So for both diagnostics, biomarkers, monitoring, all of those are needs, just like in any of the disease areas, and emerging biomarker tests and better accurate diagnostics. That's without a doubt, and that would certainly help articulate better value for the therapies, as well as obviously serving patient needs.
All right, John, 18-year-old birthday, has been on treatment for 2, 3, 4, 10 years. Is insurance coverage going to stop at 18?
No, I don't see why we would.
It's beyond the label.
Yeah.
It'll be a
like I
tough
said earlier, I think right now, based on the studies,
Yeah.
that population inclusively would be 4 to 17.
Right.
But I think most payers have a continuity of care kind of consideration typically, that if something has been working well for, a member or a patient, typically the payer would not discontinue therapy unless there's something, that really can be very compelling in terms of criteria that one could base on. So that would be my assessment of that. I also wanted to just take a minute to go back to my answer to a previous question when I was asked about whether or not this therapy should be approved or covered, I should say. only under administration by a specialist allergist versus a primary care physician in close consultation with an allergist. I want to differentiate my answer in that for AR101, it would be far more likely that it would be under the care of an allergist. Okay. Whereas for Viaskin, I think the scenario for a pediatrician or someone in close consultation with an allergist may be considered.
Okay, great. All right, I'm going to shift gears. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to stop being nice. And I'm going to channel a few questions that are going to seem devil's advocate. There are 74 million children in this country under the age of 18. If 2% of them have peanut allergy, that's 1.5 million. If they each take a treatment at $4,000, that's $9 billion per year. If half of them don't decide to, that's $4.5 billion a year. Is a more cost-effective approach to educate parents that their children are not at such severe risk of death as they might have heard by looking at social media, make sure they know how to use an EpiPen, and do something else with these treatments other than give it to folks who are anxious. Now, I told you I was going to be offensive, and I apologize if that's framed, if it comes across that way, but I want to be a devil's advocate. Because we're not talking about chump change here, and we're talking about a huge number of kids who could get started on a treatment and then have, if you will, the psychological burden, again, being offensive, of thinking that they'll never be able to get off of it. I never got a chance to see if I could grow out of it. Now everybody tells me I have to stay on it. There are downsides to being on chronic therapy for anything. So are we jumping the gun and thinking of starting this treatment on a whole lot of children when we know that a lot of the issues, again, one of my concerns, having read the information, is that parents might be so desperate for the help they need with the burden of having a family that has to constantly manage this, that they will psychologically oversell the benefits, and in a sense, kind of we're creating a scenario in which they really shouldn't accelerate the ingestion of peanuts. I understand it was brilliantly stated. Just to be able to sit next to someone having a peanut butter sandwich, not to try to eat one yourself, I can imagine it's a tremendously liberating, must be, tremendously liberating experience. Kids going away to college where they can't have that same kind of closed environment. The ability to feel more at ease with your peers in different social situations, that must be fantastic. So, but what about the other side? Because it feels like we're going to prove this and the out-of-pocket OIT goes away. Something that could cost very little money. Now, no, there's no profit in it, so people will stop doing the kind of out-of-pocket OIT. My guess is that it will kind of go away. And we're going to have a host of children hopefully benefiting from the treatment, but there are some potential downsides. So are we missing an opportunity to talk about the anxiety and to talk about epinephrine and other things while we're managing the introduction of these treatments? Let me ask the patients first. Do you guys have these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, from a patient advocacy point of view, what we would want to encourage is that the treatment decision is between the patient and the physician, and of course, a child with parents that are involved, they're going to be part of that decision, but the real focus should be on the patient and the physician. That would be what we would advocate for. Of course, it's not what's happening every day, but that's how we would like the management of care to evolve. The other part of this is, yes, there's education around maybe, unfounded concern and anxiety in certain cases. But as you heard, we can't really help patients navigate if you are more or less likely and where you are on the continuum.
Right.
So, yeah, while the experience is going to be variable for individual patients, how we manage patients is all the same. There's no ability to say, I actually do have less risk compared to someone else. I only know that based on my history. And that leads to the hypervigilance around your own safety and food avoidance. And that's why we have low death rates. We don't have low death rates because food allergy doesn't kill people. We have low death rates because the burden of protecting yourself is on the individual. So I think that we have to take that into account, and that question is very complicated because it's not just about, I think there would be equal potential harm if we said, hey, this isn't that severe, you're not that at risk. I think that there could be a very unintended consequence with a much greater public harm if we were to give that message.
And do you think patients, regular everyday patients, understand the difference between a change in their sensitivity and being tolerant? Do you think I mean, if we spread this kind of treatment across different socioeconomic strata, language strata, are they going to understand that this patch...
My 8-year-old son understands it.
Right, I'm just saying the broad base of patients who may now be considered for treatment with these. Because I think right now the people who've been considering OIT have been at the very top. We talked about this. They've been a very rarefied group. And now we're going to go broad.
We're very careful not to say this is a cure.
Right.
We're very careful to,
Right.
even in the ICER report, to say this isn't about inducing tolerance.
Right.
And that message needs to be very clearly communicated, and the public needs to be educated on the benefits and the goals of therapy with the evidence that we have in hand. And again, I think when you do explain it, even my 8-year-old, when he was 6, he understood that concept that he wasn't going to be cured. He was just going to have some level of protection, and we'll see how much if he were to decide to therapy.
Okay. Caroline?
That was a good question. I mean,
good. I'm
no,
2 for
it
2. All
really-
right.
No, it really is. I mean, that's the dream, is to have this wonderful education out there so this unfounded anxiety isn't there and that we can find the balance. But the reality is it isn't there. I mean, our physicians only have so many minutes with us within a day. So then as a patient, we have to turn to patient organizations or social media. And we know where social media is, right? No experts here.
Right.
You know, and so that really is an issue. I mean, that's the dream. That's what we want. But it's the reality is we can't get that. We've been trying.
Well, you guys have not you, I forget if you have an organizational relationship with the manufacturers, but if there are support for educational efforts, again, I might suggest that our policy recommendation might encourage patients to view part of their responsibility to make sure that the messaging incorporates all the important things that you mentioned, Nuri. Because it's obviously there's going to be a tension, and I'm not saying it's nefarious, but the general instinct is going to be to broaden the treatment, to extend it for the financial purposes. And so in general, kind of making sure that the education that patients and families receive.
I'm glad you raised that
matched.
because we have a significant heightened concern around education and training, both for patients, caregivers, and physicians.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Oh, Dr. Gupta, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to address your point about the cost, right? So you
Yeah,
said, so in our analysis of the burden of food allergy, it was about $24.8 billion. And of that, that equaled out to about $4,000 per year per child extra that was being spent. And again, we did an analysis of disparities, and you could see a lot of those costs were around special diets, getting food, special childcare, special schools, keeping their child safe. So if you think about it, I'm just thinking about last night when I first met many of you when we walked into the lobby of the hotel, there was cheese and then there was peanuts, right? And we were just talking, we're like, wow, we're lucky we're not here with our kids because this would have freaked them out because people are eating them, you see them on the floor, people are shaking each other's hands. So what would happen with therapy where the kid wouldn't go in and eat the peanut?
Yeah.
But you're not.
Wouldn't freak, right?
Yeah. So I feel like you got to understand that in that same economic study, we did a willingness to pay. And the willingness to pay came out identical to what parents were saying they spent on out-of-pocket costs, identical. And so they know what they're willing to pay to give up the costs that they're already spending. So you can't say it's 0 to 4,000 or 5,000 or whatever you said. It is. They're already having all these out-of-pocket costs that they are spending on food allergies every year.
Yeah.
So how does that amount that they're spending compare to what could happen?
Yeah,
with
no, it's a great point. And this may be one of those situations, and it's not uncommon, where an effective treatment can increase costs on the health system, but take a load off of patients and families for whom the treatment means that they don't have to spend for special equipment or special what have you. All right, I want to do one thing really quickly, because then, no, sorry, I need to keep going.
It'd be malpractice for us not to do the education and stuff.
Sorry?
It'd be absolute malpractice for us not to continue with the education efforts. One would never exist without the other.
Right. The clinical specialty that you guys represent for us today, you're on the cusp of a really important event. Probably one of your most common complaints is about to have effective FDA-approved treatment. And that doesn't happen every day. So I think, again, it's a real opportunity not to be missed for collaboration and for action that will make sure that we try to get this right. And it's hard because not all the interests are aligned, not every day of the week. Okay, manufacturers, here comes your actually, I said curveball. This is a high heater right at your chin. Damn it. Stop coming to the patient community and clinicians with evidence for new treatments in which you have failed to measure quality of life over an adequate duration of time to help people figure out the true value of your product. Stop doing that. Oh, sorry. We constantly hear that we're too early, that the evidence is inadequate. It's because you don't build this into your clinical trials, because the market doesn't make you do it. The FDA doesn't make you do it. Unfortunately, the patients don't make you do it. I think patients personally should refuse to participate in any clinical trial in which quality of life is not a measure. They should just say, no, do better. So, do better. 3 years, we heard clinical experts saying, we know 3 years, it's just not that much longer. So, do the trials and get the better evidence. And I know you guys have an answer for this, but there's a frustration that builds, especially in this group, because they see it time after time. But can you address it in this context of what were the barriers for your doing it when you knew the clinical experts were going to say we need 3 years?
The barriers for waiting
for doing a 3-year trial.
Well, you design a pivotal trial to show safety and efficacy. At least that's the criteria we have.
How about this?
We built in the quality of life.
I know that's how you design it because your customer is the FDA.
Exactly.
If your customer were the patient, that would not be your outcome. Your outcome would be patient-centered outcomes that matter to patients.
And are you suggesting a 3-year placebo-controlled trial, or looking at quality of life changes over the 3 years? Like, because
there are different ways to try to structure it.
Yeah,
but
and I think it's worth just. I know you guys deal with all sorts of different diseases, but I think we have to recognize it's different when you have an asymptomatic disease like this. It's and the quality of life approaches are, and the way you have to think about this is really, it's a little different from when you're symptomatic on a day-to-day basis. And in the placebo-controlled phase, where you're still avoiding, you still have access to epinephrine. If it's a blinded study, why would you expect any differences in quality of life in the placebo versus the active during that first year until you know you're benefiting from it? And that's where we're starting to, we will be showing our results from our open label phase after people have had a 1-year food challenge. And I know Aimune started to do the same thing, but I think people have to recognize that, like, if we saw big differences in that placebo-controlled part, you would wonder whether it was blinded.
Blinded, actually.
So, and then we also have this challenge of, like, what's the right instruments, like Matt touched on before. Like, we were using the FAQ-LQ, which was not really developed for this purpose.
I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I hear what you're saying. I'm anticipating some of the comments. But again, it is important, I think, that industry be part of an effort to improve the evidence that can really guide clinicians and patients, both in the short and the long term. And that commitment doesn't stop at FDA approval. It definitely does continue. So I hope that the patient community and the clinical experts will hold you, as others should, to account, because that really is going to be critical for us to get the best out of these treatments. I'd have to ask one more question before we move to final comments, and that is about the price, since you haven't announced it yet. But you've heard about the uncertainty. You've acknowledged there's a lot of uncertainty still. The ICER model had, as all models do, had to make assumptions. And I'm not sure Greg gave it full enough voice, but there were a lot of assumptions made that were, if you will, in favor, we thought, of the choices that we had in favor of showing value for the treatment. And it started, in some sense, with the ability to use the evidence from the survey that Ken Mendez and his group did. But there were other choices that were made. Given the high level of uncertainty and the fact that we may know within 2 or 3 years, I just want to ask you, wouldn't it be not unreasonable, instead of baking in all of the benefits that have been assumed as part of the ICER model and saying, we don't know yet, let's shave some of that price off. Let's make it easier for access, and then we'll learn more about this and be able to increase the price in conjunction with the true benefits shown for patients. It's a model that it doesn't happen very often, where uncertainty is kind of baked into the price at launch. But I'm just curious about your thoughts on, in this context, when you acknowledge the high amount of uncertainty that that remains here, what do you think about taking some off the top as part of a bargain to try to make sure that patients get good access to these treatments?
Let me just reiterate.
You're not speaking for your company.
I'm working in medical affairs. Okay, I'm speaking to value in a currency that I
so you're
am an expert.
So tell your colleagues what do you think.
I do know that our company's committed to ensuring affordability and access to patients and caregivers.
Don't tell me you had that written down.
I'm going to give you the party line. Because
Don't tell me you had that written down. Sarah Palin read her hand. Don't read that. Don't read that.
Well,
Todd, what do you have to say?
It's not my thing.
I told you, a high heater right here.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing, and I would say we are
Go
different.
ahead, it's right there.
It's handwritten.
Okay.
Well, where we are is we are focused on getting our application submitted to FDA in third quarter. We don't have any pricing calculations at this point.
Okay, come talk to us. We'll have some for you. Okay, all right. What I'd like to do at the very end, before we turn to the CTAF panel's closing remarks, and we have a pretty robust policy roundtable, is to give you each a final say. Now, my guidance would be to think of the one thing you might want to ask of somebody else at this table or some other kind of group that you think is the most important thing to happen in order for us as a whole kind of society to get this right for patients. What's the one thing that should happen? And it can happen now or it can happen in the future, but it's the one thing that you'd like to ask to see, and it's usually a change or a commitment to something that you'd like to see. Either that or just the one theme from this meeting that you want to make sure that kind of is a takeaway point. And I'd really like to ask if you could do it in one sentence. One single sentence. One semicolon, if it's a short phrase on each side of it, okay? So we're going to, actually, I usually go from one end to the other, but if you want to go first, shoot.
I'll do it because...
Go for it. Let's go for it.
But I could do a run on it. But I want to talk to our 16-year-old patient in the background who after this afternoon's vote, looked quite depressed and almost in tears, and take home the silver lining as an optimist, that the word promising is what your actual conclusion was from the vote today, that this was a premature event. And I think the discussion validated what both companies felt from the start, that this should have happened a year from now. And I would like you to remember the take-home is this is promising. It's not a defeat.
Thank you. I'm going to let's start at that end, and we'll work our way down, give the patients the last say in this phase. So thank you for keeping it short, too. John?
Design studies that can really address the clinical utility question, first and foremost,
okay,
along with the validity, analytic validity, and all the other considerations. But for instance, the big question I think in this case is really, what is the clinical utility of this treatment? And the answer is, I don't think the studies really tell us. We can make some assumptions, and certainly good insight from advocacy groups and parents of kids that have the allergy, but we really don't have any answer to the clinical utility question.
Thank you. Todd?
Yeah, I think, I agree with what was just said by both of you. And I think as we move forward in this field, we all have this unique responsibility and obligation to make sure we're understanding what the patients are looking for in all of this. And as we evaluate the evidence and are rigorous with all of it, to make sure we think about what patients are telling us and what they're looking for and what's important to them as we go forward.
Thank you. Matt?
These are shared decisions. Small incremental benefits cannot be underestimated. And I think that while this is premature, that there have been some misassumptions made in the process. And I would love the opportunity to sit down in a year for this panel to look at this again with a little bit more evidence and maybe revisit some of these decisions.
Okay, thank you. Ruchi?
Today was pretty intense experience. And for all the families out there who have food allergies, I mean, we need a treatment, and we need it badly. We need it fast. It's already happening, and that's what I think is so frustrating is some are already getting treatments without regulation. And so the sooner we can get whatever data is needed to get treatments on the market for all these families, the better. Otherwise, they're going to go somewhere and get it. The people who can afford it. And we do need access for all and affordability for all to be able to obtain these with the disparities that we see right now.
Thank you very much. Caroline.
I agree. I think the conversation was a little premature. Very excited that it's promising, but the genie's been let out of the bottle, and I can't put him back in. And so now we need to move forward with the collaboration. I mean, I'm an optimist. The glass is always half full. And so I'm really excited where I think there can be some great collaboration here and insight and so forth coming forward. So I am focusing on hope, and I want everyone to do that too. So I'm asking all of you as a patient, commit, everybody, we're going to work together.
Thanks. All right.
I guess I'll keep it simple. I mean, there's obviously promise here. We're just on the beginning stages of really making some breakthroughs and advances in food allergy, and we've all heard the unmet need and the significant impact it has on people's lives. We as a patient organization, me as a father of food allergy child, absolutely want us to get the fidelity and the data and the patient-reported outcome tools that we've all been talking about today so we can measure the value accurately and we can administer care optimally. Absolutely want that. And we encourage everybody, though, to think about that patient perspective when we're making decisions, both the manufacturers, this committee, other payer organizations, and make good judgments and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, because there is something here that's promising. And like Dr. Greenhot said earlier, we are working on it. We would want to get to the things that you've all described we need. And FAIR is actually trying to do some of those things with the community. And we're here to work together to solve these gaps and just hope that everyone can, think about these decisions in a good faith manner.
All right, thanks. So before we go quickly around the CTAF panel to have very brief final comments, I hope you will join me in thanking our amazing Policy Roundtable that's produced, I think, a conversation that when twinned with any look at the evidence will enrich the decisions of people going forward. So thank you very much. I'd also like to acknowledge the people who came to make public comments, patients and others. I hope you do recognize, I'll talk a little bit in my very last statement around how it feels, I think, to be part of this process and to have some of the votes go the way they did again. But just thank you for coming and for participating. And I know the panel, I'll let you guys actually comment on this because you usually do too, but the richness of what you bring to these conversations is a way for, again, all the people who will start to make decisions about these drugs when they're FDA approved will have limited resources to look at, and they will benefit from hearing the voices, the different voices that came to the meeting today. So thank you for your participation. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so in one sentence without a semicolon, so that we can try to keep at least to the 4 o'clock close. CTAF panel members, your final thought for the day. Robert Collier.
Yeah, like I've ever kept it that short. First place, I gotta throw in. There's 2 or 3 things here that really are just profoundly in my face here. Something that was granted fast track and/or breakthrough designation by the FDA in 2012 just isn't. Okay, this is way too long after that. The use of different terms here has really been bothering me for several different things. Desensitization is now my new favorite dirty word. It has almost no meaning in here, and it got to, there's a little list I can go through here, but in the interest of short, I actually heard it actually kind of referred to as the ultimate goal. Really? That's crap. I mean, that's just crap. That's real short-sighted. I watched this panel here and this group here wrestle with the term harms, and they're talking about 2 different things. And this is very important for everybody to understand. Your use of the word harm is a different animal to these people over here. And it matters that these people over here understand that, and I tell you, they actually do. But they're wrestling with it in a different form, and you need to appreciate that too. There needs to be more training on that. Sustained unresponsiveness is obviously a better ultimate goal, but really, that's the crappiest term I may have ever heard. Okay, it's unresponsiveness? Who wants that? And you're going to sustain unresponsiveness? Got to be kidding me. You know, it's just
Bob,
really, it's
Bob,
really sad. Yeah, I know.
Charge it up. Charge it up
really
a little
not.
bit.
Anyway,
But also
I would
wrap
also
it
like
up.
to finish with a really brief thing about the advocates. There are too many groups here that are too old that are not working for the same goal here. I don't care why it is. I don't care what the past was. Get together on what the future of this thing should be and make them do it. That quality of life thing and their studies, I know why they do their studies that way. I want to change FDA's initial ask of them, not ask, demand. You got to climb on board with me and everybody else if we're going to actually make that happen.
All right, thanks. Rick? Not quite as long, if you will.
That's a tough act to follow. Ditto?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think the good news is that the FDA is likely to approve these drugs. I suspect there will be post-marketing studies which will provide a lot of the data that are going to be necessary to make this more impressive over time. I appreciate the comments of the allergists in particular as to the need for this tool and the ability to use it to try to do something that's a regulated treatment. And I appreciate the comments of the patients as a patient advocate, because they're the ones who have to experience this, and they're the ones calling out for a drug. I think the evidence is sufficient to make this drug, or either of these drugs, available to the patients so that the allergists have a tool, because this is a tool in a toolbox they don't have now.
All right, thanks. Jeff?
It's kind of hard to follow those two guys. I wrote it down, so it's one sentence. So I think this is an exciting potential treatment whose efficacy needs to be evaluated by designing and performing in clinical utility studies in partnership with patient groups and with practicing physicians. So in other words, you guys got to get together and say what matters to us and how would we measure that. And then I would go a little further to talk to docs on the street, because I mean, you know, I do deal with a lot of this stuff. I don't care if the protein goes up in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. I care if people do better. I don't care if there's fewer lesions on your MRI. I care if there's fewer attacks. So docs that practice have an input. Patients have a huge input, because this has such a huge impact on quality of life. Get together, design those studies. Hopefully it gets approved so you can do them. And I think that's going to be the thing that is really going to convince and fast track the ability for people to feel comfortable prescribing.
Thank you. Robert?
I'm one of the panel members that voted no on those first four questions about is the evidence adequate to demonstrate net health benefit. And I'm strongly in favor of these modalities. I want to see them go, but I want to see the data to confirm that society as a whole should embrace this and pay for it. If one of my kids had it, they would be getting it, but I'd be paying for it, and that's okay. But we're talking about society, the whole structure, the whole infrastructure.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Alex?
so my older son has a peanut allergy and tree nut allergies, and I've been there. I'm speeding home when the nanny gave him an almond cookie, and the guilt and recrimination when we gave him pesto, and we thought, and he had anaphylactic reaction, and ended up in the emergency department. And he's been doing well with avoidance recently, and we looked at, my wife and I looked at this report, and we looked at the data very carefully, and we just feel like there's a risk of harm here. He may end up having epinephrine shots more often. He may end up having, more, reactions. Ultimately, we don't know whether this would result in, medicalizing his condition further, and by him focusing on having more, psychological anxiety for him and maybe for us too. So I could see the potential for benefit, and I believe it is promising, and I'm excited for this field. But I feel like it's too early and we don't have enough long-term outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill?
Yep. I'm very impressed that you're taking the step to really move forward in this area, because anyone who lives with a chronic condition like this, never knowing when they'll have a reaction and worrying about it and what it might lead to, shouldn't have to live that way. And anything that will get them closer to the end game of being free of that condition is an incredible step forward. And I think not just in regard to peanut allergies, but I think as we approach this area of allergies, food allergies, if a monumental advancement goes with this particular allergy, I think it'll lead the way further in the area of food allergies. So I want to applaud you for the efforts you're making. But at the same time, you have to show it is completely safe, completely effective, and that the selling point for hopefully all children that have this condition are participating in having this treatment is that it's safe and that there is an end point that will lead them further, and they can have a vision of one day not having this condition. I'm a strong advocate for getting rid of chronic conditions, and this is something children shouldn't have to live with.
Thank you, Bill.
That's all. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick as well. So what I'm really struck with is the strong patient advocacy for this disease. We see lots of different diseases through here, and it's very impressive, and I think patients are very lucky that there's these organizations that are working hard for them. And I guess I would encourage you all to continue to put the feet to the fire of the pharmaceutical companies who in the morning told us we should say there's benefit because it's really helping people feel better, not worry, all these sorts of things, quality of life related things. Then in the afternoon when we say where's the quality of life data, we're told it's an asymptomatic disease. So I think there really needs to be pressure for that data. And I think the other thing we have to be careful of with a disease like this, where everyone wants so much to have something that will help and be beneficial, that we don't outweigh the desire for that. Don't let the desire for that outweigh a true analysis of the risks, to what Alex was saying. We all, as physicians, know many stories of drug treatments gone awry where there were adverse effects that we just didn't really pay enough attention to.
Thank you very much. Neil?
Just following Dr. Murphy, I agree. It's very promising, and we're hopeful that this in the next months and years proves to be as effective as we all hope. But just as a specialist in preventive medicine and epidemiologist, a couple of those examples are antioxidants in smokers, which actually increase mortality in 2 RCTs. Promising, but actually is probably a contraindication. The largest RCT on hormone replacement therapy, I think it was $750 million, the Women's Health Initiative. Very promising data, actually, and observational studies and case control studies, but there's a reason why they did this huge HRT, and it proved to be actually increased mortality in cancer, cardiovascular disease, cognitive outcomes, GI. There were a couple benefits. So, and I don't want to take away or say that that's what's going to happen, but that's kind of on the other side of promising areas in the prevention field that ended up not only not being promising, but increasing mortality.
Okay. Jeff?
The evidence of the promise and vice versa are not the same things.
Kim?
So I echo the fact that the genie is out of the bottle, and I really want to reiterate the point that Mr. Hong made, is that the reason why the death rate is so low is because people take responsibility for their health and they're very, very careful. And so I think it's really important that we follow the cohort that gets put on these drugs, because the true benefit we've seen today is that there is decreased anxiety and there's improved comfort and administration and experience with epinephrine. And we want to make sure that people don't lose their vigilance in being careful because of that.
Thanks. Ralph?
I acknowledge the disappointment by the patient groups and the experts and the patients in the room related to our votes, related to the efficacy of the medications. And I think you've gotten the message about what we need to do. I come from a registry background. I run 10 cardiovascular registries for the American College of Cardiology and work a lot with the FDA. And this is an ideal opportunity. I'm guessing that the FDA may ask you to do post-approval studies that will have embedded patient-reported outcomes and quality of life to answer some of these key questions. And even if they do or don't, I was looking on the website to see what sort of registries are in the allergy space. FAIR has one, I guess AAFA has one, and then AAAI has something. And I would think, and we have the past president here with us, so I think this might be a great opportunity for one of these registries to actually take on this as a mission in terms of long-term follow-up, in terms of the issues of when you can go off the drug, issues related to the patient-reported outcomes, and issues of quality of life to be able to inform the clinical community.
Thanks a lot. Felicia?
So you said before that small incremental benefits should not be underestimated. I think they should also not be overestimated. And that's my concern. I share Kim's worry about responsibility. There are too many people looking for the magic pill, and I want to make sure that we enhance the responsibility, the patient education, and the shared decision-making rather than decrease it.
Thank you very much. Second.
I just want to echo what everyone, so many people have said before about, I think this is an exciting time, and I think things look promising. But when asked to vote on, is the evidence adequate, I think it was pretty clear to me that it was not. I also want to kind of talk a little bit about something that was brought up, but I just feel like we need to do a better job of, which is this feels like a disease that is really crying out for some sort of risk stratification. To say we just throw up our hands and says everybody is at the risk of death at any time. I mean, I can't imagine saying, oh, you have a high blood pressure of 130. It's identical to somebody who has a high blood pressure of 250. Oh, you have diabetes, and whether you have A1C is 6.9 or 10.2, it's the same. It's hard to imagine another disease where we have absolutely no ability to risk stratify. And so I really feel like this is a situation where the for-profit drug companies do not have an incentive to try to narrow the group of people that the drugs are going to be beneficial for. This has to come from the patient advocate group, because imagine a world where we can say, yes, you have this disease, but you don't actually have to worry because you are part of that 50% that is actually super low risk. That is where we need to get to, where you don't have parents incredibly worried because they have one of the low-risk peanut allergies. We need that information. That is the work that has to be done, and that's the goal that we should be trying to get to, because honestly, even if these drugs work, the patients and parents are still going to have to be super vigilant. We need to better risk stratify which patients are low risk.
Great, thank you. Rena?
It always feels when we vote no on a health benefit or low value, when we do our value assessments, that we're sort of letting down the experts and the patients, and that I feel that in the room today. But I really just want to emphasize to the non-voters in the room how literally we interpret these questions and what they mean and what we're saying in them. We're not saying we don't think these are great sounding treatments or the trials weren't successful, because the trials measured desensitization, which to us is a surrogate marker and hasn't been shown to translate into better caregiver burden and fewer attacks, and something's already working because there's 4 deaths per year. So avoidance and epinephrine really work. So it's going to be important to show that all of this is going to really change what we want to see changed. But I think everybody in this room is saying we're excited for the field to have this sort of fork in the road. But we want to, and I don't think that the meeting was premature. I think that the trials are premature. I think we're here because they're about to be FDA approved and they're going to be on the market and people are going to be getting them. But so I feel like when we talk about what's premature, maybe the outcomes were premature.
Yeah, I was struck by how I'd say the fear of the disease is as or more important than the disease itself. Though it's real, it's potentially incapacitating. And while that may argue for more mental health involvement and addressing that fear, I think it's best dealt with by having a treatment that has both patient-centered and other clinical outcomes that is shown to improve.
All right, thanks. So just very, very briefly, I want to just kind of emphasize again what Ralph and Rena and others have said throughout the day, which is the vote on the evidence is not a testament to a lack of appreciation for the burden that patients and families live with this condition. I think certainly the people who came to testify today and the people at the front table, and over time, we, in talking to them, have heard a lot of stories. Many of us either have children or relatives with peanut allergy or certainly know folks who do. And the testimony and other aspects have enriched that. But the vote on the evidence is kind of what it is, and it is a statement of where the evidence is today. It's a snapshot, and it's a snapshot to guide both, hopefully, the generation of better evidence going forward, and it's a statement of where the limitations are right now that patients and clinical experts should try to address, as well as payers, certainly. You heard, from I think a pretty representative payer that this is not an area where they're going to try to likely micromanage the tests that would be required to gain access to this treatment. There's going to be a lot of trust and a lot of hope that going forward we will learn more, and that we'll learn more about how to risk stratify and all of the other things. But this really is a point in time that specialties get every once in a while when there's a real paradigm shift. And it allows us all to think again about how do we get this right for patients? How do we get this right? Because it involves everybody doing something usually a little bit differently than they have before. So I hope that our report in this meeting, we hear that the payers who pay attention to the reports really do often look at the webcasts and interpret the evidence in the context of the things that are said here today. The votes on potential other benefits and contextual issues. That really is a broader view of what's going on than many people usually get. So I just want to thank you again for participating in the meeting. I want to thank the CTAF for your very kind of assiduous attention to the evidence and to the testimony. Again, to our participants on the roundtable, you were fantastic. We'll be finalizing a final report that will capture the votes and much of the testimony in a couple of weeks, before July 10. So that's the estimate. But with that, I just want to thank you all again, and I hope we do come back to this topic in a few years with better evidence, maybe even some additional treatments, but more opportunities to figure out how to do the right thing for patients. Thanks very much.